Thank you for joining us for Sermons on Demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. We provide these videos as a way to share the pulpit messages and teachings offered at Friendship Grace Brethren Church. If you find these videos a helpful resource, please drop us a note at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com. Now open your Bibles and get ready to dig into the Word of God. Okay. Do we have any questions or comments tonight before we get going?
Oh,
Nothing being heard. Then let's go into the background of the book of Joshua. I sent you a link so you could download the outline of Joshua if you wanted it. The title of the book of Joshua in the Hebrew text is, guess what? Yeshua?
yeah,
Joshua? Yeshua?
Yeshua.
Yeah.
Yeshua.
The name of the leading character and the leading character of the book. The word means Yahweh is salvation or Yahweh saves. The Bible doesn't identify who the author is. Many liberal textual critics believe that it's actually a composition of a bunch of authors, probably written later in time than what we think it is. Gleason Archer, in his famous book, Old Testament Survey, that anybody that went to Bible college and took Old Testament has a copy of or had a copy of, he made a really good defense of a singular author being the author. He doesn't come out and specifically say that Joshua is guaranteed the author, because we can't do that because we're not sure. But the author is somebody that was firsthand observant of much of what's in the book, and there's a lot of us and we references in the book, and there are vivid descriptions of what they saw. So clearly it's somebody from the time of the conquest that's the author. An early authorship is required by the internal evidence of the book. Many of the Canaanite cities are using older names by the author. An author from later in Israel's history would not be using those names because those weren't the names in use anymore. So that also leads to it being someone earlier. At the time of the writing of the book, Tyre had not yet conquered Sidon, and that happened in the 12th century BCE. So if it's before that, that puts it into the time of the conquest. So clearly there's enough internal evidence to say that someone from Joshua's time is the author. It's clear that Joshua wrote some of the book just by looking at the statements that he makes in the book. So I think it's pretty hard not to conclude that Joshua is the author, but not everybody agrees, and it's not clearly defined. So we just say we're not sure. Since an eyewitness wrote much of the book, the date of writing has to be during the time of Joshua. While on the larger historical scale, there's considerable debate about when the conquest took place in antiquity, and that's beginning to be rectified in non-biblical archaeological work now, because of the correction of some historical timelines that were in error because of an interpretation by one person. Scripture provides us some factoids as to when the Exodus and then the conquest took place and so forth. We can go to 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So the building of the temple was 480 years after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. So that's one factoid that we need to put into the bank. Then you go to Judges chapter 11 and verse 26. While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Er and its villages, and in all the cities that are on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years, why did you not deliver them with that time? So now we have a statement from Jephthah, whatever his name is. Too many THs in there. Harper probably could say that one much better than me. The period of the judges was about 300 years until the time of Jephthah. That gives us another little factoid information. And then you go to Judges 14:10, and now behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said, these 45 years since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel walked in the wilderness. Now behold, I am this day 85 years old. So when we look at all this, the autobiographical story talking about Caleb reminisced about how God's faithfulness to him over many years. He confirmed that God had kept him alive the past 45 years as he had been promised. So 45 years from the time Moses gave him the promise. Actually, Caleb was the recipient of two divine promises. One is that his life would be prolonged, and the other that he would someday inherit the territory he bravely explored near Hebron. But 45 years is a long time to wait for fulfillment of a pledge, a long time for faith to live on a promise. Yet Caleb did wait through the weary years of the wilderness wandering and the demanding years of the conquest. Caleb had strong faith in the promises of God. Caleb's remarks provide information for determining the length of the conquest by Canaan by the Israelites. Caleb stated in verse 7 that he was 40 years old when he went to spy out the land. The wilderness wanderings lasted 38 years, thus bringing Caleb's age to 78 at the beginning of the conquest. Caleb then said he was 85 at the end of the conquest, so the conquest lasted 7 years. This is confirmed by Caleb's reference in verse 10 to God's sustaining grace for 45 years since Kadesh Barnea, that is 38 years of wilderness wandering plus 7 years of the conquest. 7 years to complete the conquest brings us to 1399. I must have stepped over something there's the paragraph I missed. 480 years from the 4th year of Solomon backwards would be 966 BC. That gives us 480 years before the 4th year of Solomon, which was in 966 BC. Going backwards brings us to 1446 BC. That's the year of the Exodus, and then the beginning of the conquest of the Promised Land in 1406 BC. And then Judges 11:26 confirms this, 300 years from the conquest from Jephthah, and then 140 years from Jephthah to the 4th year of Solomon equals 480 years. So we have some biblical support for some pretty good timing of when the Exodus happened. And what's really interesting is they are now beginning to see in that period of Egypt's history a rather large transformation occurring. And Ramses II and his military might rapidly decreased about 1446 from all the records that we can determine now, when those records are put onto the right timeline. The purpose of the book is primarily historical. The book provides an accurate historical record of the conquest of the Promised Land. The main purpose was to tell the story to the Jews, how they got to that piece of dirt, and what transpired to bring them there. Remember, the people that made the conquest are either babies or when they left Egypt, or were born in the wilderness. So they needed to understand the history of how they got there. It's a fulfillment. It proves God's faithfulness because it's a fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis 13:15. For the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. And of course, the verses in context there describe the land from the Euphrates down to the brook of Egypt, not the Nile, but a separate river in what is today, or what was then called, Goshen. So we have this promise of a piece of dirt for Abraham's offspring forever. Then in Genesis 15, verses 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I'll give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The Lord of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. God gave them all of that land. Here's the promise for all of the land to you. And so what we see in the book of Joshua is a fulfillment of that promise. The failure to obtain some of the property, some of the dirt, was not a failure of God to deliver it. It was a failure of the troops to take it. God said, I'd give it to you. You just got to go take it. And he would give them the ability to beat the armies, and they didn't do it. They didn't do it properly. The Apostle Paul taught that the events of the Exodus and the conquest are meaningful for Christians in that those events possess significance as forerunners or types of what was going to occur for the church. The Greek form of the name Joshua, Yahweh saves, is Jesus. As Joshua led Israel to victory over our enemies and into possession of the promised land, and as he interceded for the nation after it had sinned and been defeated, so does Jesus. So Paul's setting up Joshua as a forerunner of a model for what Jesus would later be. I'm not big into typology, but some you just can't argue against. Joshua brought the people to God. Jesus brings the people to God. Joshua brought the people into promised rest. Jesus brings us into promised rest. You see all the similarities. And that's basically the background of the book of Joshua. Any comments or questions on that one? Sorry, I got all gobbledygook there in the timing.
But I also thought, didn't God tell him, if you obey me, you will get the whole land. If you don't obey me, you will not get the whole land.
Yeah, they had to be obedient to have it all, and they never possessed it all. They never possessed really from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt. The closest they got was during David and Solomon, when they occupied some territory up by the Euphrates, but it never really was part of Israel. It's been promised to them, but they've never really occupied it. Can you imagine if today they took this passage from Genesis and said, God gave it to us, so we're going to go take Syria, we're going to take most of Iraq, and we're going to take some of Iran, and we're just going to take all of that. That's all ours. We get to determine what happens here. Can you imagine what would happen? But that's what God promised them. They just never have completely occupied it, and they don't occupy it today. Okay, let's move on. Read Deuteronomy 23, 9 through 14, and then try to explain the passage. Deuteronomy 23, 9 through 14. When you are encamped against your enemies, then you shall keep yourself from every evil thing. And if any man among you becomes unclean because of a nocturnal emission, then he shall go outside the camp. He shall not come inside the camp. When evening comes, he shall bathe himself in water, and as the sun sets, he may come inside the camp. You shall give a place outside the camp, and you shall go to it. You shall have a trowel with your tools, and when you sit down outside, you shall dig a hole with it, and turn back and cover up your excrement. Because the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to give you your enemies before you, therefore your camp must be holy, so that he may not see anything indecent among you and turn away from you. So what's going on in this passage? The verses immediately before this, chapter 23, 1 through 8, deal with religious purity. This section deals with purity of the war camp. This is all about the men getting prepared to go and fight the battles. The Hebrews were about to engage in a holy war. If you were to read Augustine's many writings on a holy war, the war that Israel was about to wage against the Canaanites is one of the best examples of a true holy war. And they were about to engage in that to gain the territory that God had given to Abraham and to the Hebrews. Because it was a holy war, God required the warriors to remain in a state of ceremonial cleanliness. They had to remain ceremonially clean. That was difficult for them. Remember, touching a dead body made you unclean. Touching any kind of anything filthy made you ceremonially unclean. God is saying, look, this is a holy war. I want you to be separated. I want you to be ceremonially clean. And so he required them to take actions that before they went into battle, they could stand up and be examined by a priest and be determined to be ceremonially clean. Why would that make a difference?
The Lord was in their midst.
Exactly. As I studied this, I wondered, why would God be making these kind of rules for a forward operating base of the military? And then it came. I understood it. Verse 14: because the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp. God is in the middle of their camp with them. They had to keep it holy. They had to keep it pure. So when they had to go to the bathroom, they had to go dig a latrine and cover it back up and make it outside the camp, so that they had to remain ceremonially pure, so that as they went out as God's army to fight the holy war, remember, God was punishing the Canaanites because of their paganism, their filth, and their rejection of Him. And the military that was doing that were the Hebrews. And so God was telling them, you've got to be ceremonially clean, so that as we go out to fight in this holy war, you remain clean. They needed to be pure because God was with them in the camp. So when they had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and walk outside the camp, it was a reminder God's in the camp. When they had to be reviewed by a priest, it was a reminder God's in the camp. It was a reminder God was with them. And God's not concerned about how clean we are. God's concerned with how much do we focus on him? How much have we separated ourselves? And that's really what the word holy means, separated. How separated are we from the filth of the world? And that was just a physical reminder to the Hebrew military that they were fighting a holy war and they needed to be purified standing next to God. Does that make sense? Okay, zooming right along tonight. Read Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 4. And then we're going to try to explain this one as well. Whoops, too far. When you come into the land that the Lord God is giving you for an inheritance and have taken possession of it and live in it, you shall take some of the first fruit off the ground, or of the ground, which you harvest from your land that the Lord your God is giving you. And you shall put it in a basket, and you shall go to the place that the Lord your God will choose to make his name to dwell there. And you shall go to the priest who is in office at the time and say to him, I declare today, the Lord your God, that I have come into the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to give us. Then the priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down before the altar of the Lord your God. By the way, he gave it back after they were done. So, what's going on here? Why this injunction to go in and take these first fruits?
Jesus is the first fruit.
Okay, he's the first fruits of the resurrection, correct?
Could it be a thank offering to God for bringing them to the land and
Exactly.
giving them?
Yeah, it was worship of God for his faithfulness in giving them the land. This is not a perpetual offering. This is the first offering. This is what you give God, or this is what they were told to give God when they first got a harvest in the new land. God said, take your first harvest, take the best of it, and bring it to the altar and offer it. Celebration of God's faithfulness in giving them the promised land to the Hebrews. Now, the reason I say that this is not a perpetual offering, God had already given instructions for the special tithe offering. Remember the extra tithe that they were to give every third year? That was in Deuteronomy 14. And since instructions for this kind of offering had already been given, it seems that the instructions were to be carried out once, not annually. Its offering and subsequent offering were designed to celebrate the transition of the Hebrews. Now this is I think the most important part about this. When they got into the land and they had their first harvest, what were they no longer?
Slaves.
Say that again?
Slaves.
Right, they were no longer slaves, but what were they for 40 years?
Depended upon the manna.
Yes, but what else?
Provision.
What did they do for 40 years?
Wandered,
right.
in the wilderness.
They were a wandering nomadic people for 40 years. They didn't go to the gas station and get directions, and their wives are still smacking them for not getting directions. And they took them 40 years to figure out how to go, a couple hundred miles. And they were nomads. They were living in tents in the wilderness, depending on God to feed them. What happened as soon as they had a harvest in the Promised Land, or as soon as they ate from the Promised Land?
The manna stopped.
The manna stopped, right. They had gone from being a nomadic people to being an agricultural people, a sort of unified people, a collective of tribes that were unified into a non-nomadic neighbor or non-nomadic people group. Most of the people around them were nomadic, but they no longer were. They were now an agricultural people. They had to learn how to grow grapes. They had to learn how to plant seed. They had to, they knew how to take care of their animals, but they didn't know how to grow food for them. And so they now were at the cusp of becoming something different. This offering celebrates their transition from former slaves in Egypt to nomads to an agricultural permanent society. The next step on becoming a unified people. Comments, questions? Well, we are smoking today.
You said that they would give the baskets back. Why would they give them back?
So they could eat from it. They offered it. I think it's the very next verse that says that. They offered it to God, and then God rewarded them by returning it to them. I think it was the very next verse.
No, but it doesn't say that.
No, where did it go to?
No.
Someplace else.
No matter. That's okay.
Yeah, I read it this morning or this afternoon, whenever it was. Anyway, I'll have to look for that again. Okay, read Deuteronomy 30, 11 through 20. Deuteronomy 30, 11 through 20. And then we'll try to explain this one. For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven, that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea, that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can do it. See, I've set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of. But if your heart turns away, and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him, for he is your life and the length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. So, what's happening in this passage?
It's God's promise to the Israelites that if they're obedient, he's going to keep his promises to them.
Yeah. Yeah, let's go all the way back to the beginning and look at what he says. For the commandments that I command you today is not too far from you, neither is it far off. It's not in heaven that you should go, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. They didn't need to send someone to heaven. God brought it to them. God brought them the law. God brought them the covenant that they agreed to through Moses, and now through Joshua again, returning to them the information that they needed in order to be obedient. They didn't need to do like many of the other gods around that required people to die to know what to do. Moses is teaching the Hebrews about their fellowship and their relationship with each other. Moses is not teaching salvation by the keeping of the law. That's not what's in view. What's in view is, how do you live together properly? How do you get to remain in the land properly? Do what I tell you to do. Moses had already presented to them the reality that salvation comes by faith, as he demonstrated through how Abraham received his salvation. Abraham trusted God and it was counted to him for righteousness. And Moses taught that. So the life of the nation was to consist of obeying the Lord. The obedience would be passed down from one generation to another, since godly parents produce godly children, typically. So parents who choose to obey the Lord were also making a significant choice for their posterity. Since the Lord is their life, no wonder Moses concluded this message by once again urging people to love the Lord, to listen to him, to obey him, to hold fast to him. Moses was telling them, look, it's very important that you do this. It's important that you live a proper life. It's important that you present to the people that come after you how to follow the Lord. Moses was essentially saying to them, look, it's a binary choice. Follow, get to stay in the land. Don't follow, eventually get taken out of the land. And of course, we see that happen. They were in the land for hundreds of years, and then they lost the majority of the land in 722, and then in 586 they lost the rest of it. And they never again possessed it without somebody else occupying it until May of 1948, when they declared independence. And God said, look, that's the way it's going to be. And I would argue that they still don't possess the land properly. No. That will come during the millennial kingdom, not before. So
but
God was
according to John 3:36, isn't it the same today? He who believes in the Son has everlasting life, and he who does not believe in the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abides with him.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
we have the same responsibility.
Principle?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Don't we have the same principle?
Yes, absolutely. Salvation has always been by faith. It's never been by keeping the law, because nobody ever can keep the law. Salvation has always been by faith. But we have responsibility for what we are to do because we are believers. I talked about this in the message on Sunday, that we've been given the faith that we need to believe. We just have to believe. God's responsible, but so am I for my salvation. God gave me the faith to believe. I just had to believe. I couldn't not believe, but I still had to believe. And it was the same for them. But I think in this passage, and in most passages talking about Israel like this, it's not talking about salvific life. It's talking about temporal life, staying in the land, staying in where God promised them to be. God didn't make a territory promise to Christians. He didn't promise a piece of dirt to the church. And God never talks about, I shouldn't say never, rarely talks about temporal blessings. He typically talks about eternal blessings in relation to the church. But in relation to Israel, he talked about temporal blessings most often, about being in the land, possessing the land that flows with milk and honey, or losing it because you follow other gods. And that's what Moses is pointing out here as they're getting ready to cross over the Jordan. Okay, we're moving really fast today. This is my last one. Whoops. Maybe. Here it is. Read Joshua 3:14 through 17. What principle or principles do you see in this passage? Joshua 3:14 through 17. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, as soon as those bearing the Ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priest bearing the Ark were dipped in the brink of the water, now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of the harvest. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, and those flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now the priest bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and Israel passed over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. So what principle do we see here?
It's a repeat of the Red Sea.
It's like the Red Sea, yes.
The leaders have to move first.
Believers have to move
faith.
first. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but maybe first isn't the right adjective or verb.
And they had to step forward in faith.
Right? They had to move when God said move, even when it doesn't look like anything's happening. So what Linda was saying is believers have to move first. Believers have to move, or they had to move.
The leaders had to
Oh,
move
leaders.
first.
Oh, I'm sorry, I heard the wrong word. Leaders. Yeah.
I'll loan you my hearing aids.
I'm sorry. What? Hey, hey, Sonny, what you're saying? Yeah, the priests had to get to the water, and now think about. We're given the hint here, but it doesn't mean a lot to us mostly. Where did it go here? Yeah, look at verse 15. As soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and their feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the time of the harvest. This was not a gentle flowing Jordan River that's relatively shallow, easy to cross. This was a mighty raging river at the time, because it was the time that all the snow melt comes down and is just really, it is well above its banks. So not only is it much deeper, it's rushing much faster. What else happens when rivers overflow their banks? What happens on what used to be shoreline now is underwater? What happens to that ground?
It's kind of muddy, mushy.
Kind of muddy, kind of difficult to walk across. It's really difficult area. Now think about the priests. They knew what would happen if they touched the ark wrong. They'd be DRT, right? That God had proven that. And they're walking through some difficult, treacherous land. They couldn't see the rocks and the sticks and everything. There was a certain amount of faith just in approaching the river. And then standing there. And then God stopping the water. Not only just stopping the water, but we're told they walked across on dry ground.
Dried it up.
Yeah, God dried it up. How does that happen so fast? Right? Miracle is the only way it happens that fast. But like Linda said, the leaders had to move first. The leaders had to get out in front. They were following the ark. The ark had to be there. It didn't look like God was doing anything. It would take, I think, a lot less faith to watch God stop the water and then they say, okay, now we can cross. Now we can get wet. But no, the priests had to be in the water before the water would stop. They had to make a commitment to do what God said, even when it doesn't look like God's doing anything. Okay, there's all of our observations, so now make this a principle. How quickly we've forgotten how to do this.
God is always working in the background, whether we see him or not.
Okay, good. Develop and more.
So we have to be ready to move or move even though we don't see or know what he's going to do.
Right. When God is clear about what he tells us to do, we don't need to stop and pray about it. When God's already told you what to do and it's clear, you don't need to stop and pray, should I do that? The answer is yes, you should do that. The prayer was answered before you prayed it. If God tells you to do it, do it. It doesn't matter what is happening around you. It doesn't matter what you think is going to happen. What matters is, are you obedient? The principle is we need to trust God and be obedient when it appears that, even when it appears that God has not begun to do his part. Sometimes God just tests our faithfulness. Was God testing their faithfulness so that he would know if they were faithful?
No, so they would know.
So they would know. Imagine what a boost it is to the morale of an army that's about to go in and conquer territory, to be obedient to God and watch God stop up a big old river and they walk across on dry ground because they were obedient. I wonder, was there any debate among the elders and among the priests? They hadn't yet gotten to the river, and they stopped. Now wait, God hasn't done anything yet. The water's still there. We're not getting in. That's going to be dangerous. Can you hear the debate going on? I suspect there probably was a debate. Some weren't ready yet to trust. Some weren't ready yet to do what God had said because it doesn't look like God's going to be faithful. It'd be more clear God was going to be faithful if the river had already stopped up. But sometimes we have to do what looks like what we know God wants us to do, even though it looks like it's he's not doing his part yet. That's faithfulness. That's obedience. Any questions or comments on that one? We breezed through these tonight, and I got to the end of them without more. I normally do 6, and I only did 5 because I haven't been getting to the 6th for the last few weeks, so I only did 5. And tonight I needed one. See, I just wasn't prepared. Thank you for watching or listening to this teaching on demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. Please consider sending us an email at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com to let us know how this teaching may have helped you. Please also consider joining us in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church, located at 10251 Metro Parkway, Suite 116, Fort Myers, Florida, just south of the intersection of Metro and Colonial Boulevard. Sunday school begins at 9 and worship service at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church.